Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing recent developments in Alberta that have seen legal aid lawyers in that province voting for job action. Legal Aid Alberta is a publicly funded, not-for-profit organization that provides affordable legal services in family law, domestic violence, child welfare, immigration, and criminal defense. Alberta has no formal Legal Aid Act, but there is an agreement between the Law Society of Alberta and the Alberta government that lawyers in private practice provide legal aid services. But now 3 organizations that represent hundreds of defense lawyers in Alberta are threatening job action if the provincial government doesn't increase funding for Legal Aid Alberta. They say lawyers who take legal aid cases are underpaid compared to those in Manitoba, BC, and Ontario, and that many are leaving to become crown prosecutors in order to obtain better compensation. And they say this undermines the justice system. Here today to talk about these developments are 2 of the lawyers leading the charge. Danielle Boisvert is the president of the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association in Edmonton, and Ian Savage is the president of the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Now, there is a new development, which is that the your organizations have voted for job action. So, Danielle, what exactly does that mean?
What that means is that our 3 organizations unanimously or overwhelmingly, I should say, voted to implement a small-scale show of solidarity and force by withdrawing a limited number of services over the next 2 to 3 weeks, from the 8th to the 21st of August. And those certificates from Legal Aid are small and limited in scope.
So what services are they? What exactly?
So duty counsel certificates. So where a lawyer will go in on a court date where there's dozens of people there, many of which are self-represented. They need assistance to navigate the legal system. They don't know where to start. They may need assistance with a bail hearing or a quick guilty plea at that point, or even just to understand their rights. So duty counsels are there to help them, guide them through that process. Other types of certificates are that we are no longer accepting for this time period are certificates to represent complainants of sexual assault cases where they have rights to a counsel in certain parts of trials. And then also where a lawyer is appointed by the court to assist a self-represented litigant in cross-examining certain witnesses in a variety of types of trials.
And now, Ian, can you explain why it's those particular types of legal aid work that your organizations are withdrawing services from and not others? And how did you come to the decision to withdraw those particular services?
Sure. I mean, what people need to understand first and foremost is that it's the criminal defense lawyers in this country and in our province in particular that the public has empowered the trust in to represent those vulnerable people. Nobody else is doing this job. The prosecutors aren't defending the accused persons, they're prosecuting them. The judges are adjudicating. Everyone's doing their role, and we have a role. And if you take our role out of the system, you have China, to be blunt, okay? So bear that in mind. Now, we, of course, because we've devoted our professional and often big chunks of our personal lives to this type of work, we, of anyone, are most knowledgeable about the impact removing any services that we provide would have on those vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals. So we have tried at this early stage in our job action to focus and pinpoint the withdrawal of certain limited services that, frankly, will have some impact on the court system and bring the government's focus to bear on our situation, but yet will hopefully cause the least pain, so to speak, to the individuals that would ordinarily receive those services.
Yeah, certainly no one wants the vulnerable people to be hurt, but I think ultimately it's a balancing of getting the government to pay attention to the issue here and not and still providing some service for clients who need them. I really want to focus on the role of legal aid and the role of defense lawyers in our justice system, and what our country would look like if we didn't have lawyers doing defense work and legal aid work. We do have to go to break now, but we will be right back to focus on that incredibly important issue. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing a recent decision by certain legal aid lawyers in Alberta to vote for some job action in that province related to what they call chronic underfunding of the legal aid system. Now, Danielle, I really want to focus on the role legal aid plays and the role criminal defense plays in our justice system. So can you explain why regular Canadians should care about legal aid and maybe what our justice system would look like without legal aid lawyers?
Certainly. Well, our Canadian justice system is premised on due process, fair representation, and good representation to the extent that people who require services through legal aid and all people that require our services have experienced, knowledgeable lawyers who are not overworked and underpaid and struggling in their own lives to find the time to represent these people in a very, very busy schedule, because we become overworked when we have to take on way too many files. So why should Canadians care about that? Well, as the Crown prosecutors indicated when they were lobbying for raises, you get to a situation where you are overworked, underpaid, overwhelmed, you have no supports, you have no access to mental health supports, and you burn out. What happens when there are no defense lawyers? As my friend Mr. Savage indicated, it becomes China. There is nobody to protect the rights and the due process of any individual person that goes before the courts, whether they are a criminal with a criminal record as long as my leg, or whether they are somebody who is entering the doors of a courthouse for the very first time, sometimes facing very serious charges and having no idea how to navigate the system. So without legal aid that provides counsel for people that would otherwise not be able to afford a lawyer, the system will essentially collapse in and of itself. The increase to the overall cost of the criminal justice system will exponentially increase, because the number of hours required for a self-represented file in court is significantly higher than the same file where you have a lawyer representing the defense or the accused person. So the savings by having a properly funded legal aid system are significant. There are savings not just to legal aid itself, but to all other aspects of the public purse.
Ian, let's take a step back for a second, because I think a lot of our viewers might not understand how legal aid works. So how does someone qualify for it? Is there an income threshold, and how flexible is that? And what types of services are available in legal aid cases?
Certainly, it varies from province to province. Many provinces have a publicly funded legal aid program whereby it's all staffed by lawyers employed directly by legal aid. Our province in Alberta is not that. There certainly are a significant number of lawyers employed by legal aid that do a fair amount of work, but most of the work in the criminal justice system for defense is done by private lawyers like Danielle and myself, who take what are called certificates or a contract from legal aid to represent an individual person on the charges they're facing, essentially. And so a person, yes, there's two criteria that makes a person eligible for legal aid in Alberta. Number one, the charges have to be serious enough that there is a possibility of jail if they're convicted. And number two, the financial eligibility. And unfortunately, the government, through its payments to legal aid in Alberta, controls that number, so to speak, as well. And you may recall a number of years ago, we had to shame the then Minister of Justice in Alberta by saying, even people on AISH, which is our sort of program for the mentally and physically handicapped, even people who are on that program are not receiving eligibility for legal aid. And so that was
Just the
quickly
threshold
reversed.
was that low?
Yeah. Well, guess what? Guess what? We're back down to those numbers. In some cases, those people that on the handicap program are now again becoming not eligible for legal aid because the government has arbitrarily suppressed that income level, that minimum income level so low to be eligible for legal aid. So it's become like obviously untenable.
We've got to go to break, Ian, but when I come back, I want to talk about the funding at issue here, because this is about how much money lawyers are paid for legal aid. And I want to explain, I want to get insight into how it compares province by province, how the services compare, and what the government's response has been. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we are discussing a recent vote for job action by some Alberta legal aid lawyers. Now, Ian, I want to ask about the funding, because the funding is at issue here. So what can you tell me about how lawyers who do legal aid work in Alberta are compensated, and how that compares to other provinces, and what exactly you have asked the Alberta government to do?
Sure. I mean, a lot of these, there's a lot of interrelated components to this. It's not just a question of the lawyer's pay. I mentioned just briefly before commercial that the financial eligibility guidelines are an issue for recipients. And that, of course, then drives the budget partly as well. Of course, the more people eligible for a program means, generally speaking, increased costs. Now, on the compensation issue, for the lawyers, the private lawyers who are taking the work and doing the work in the courtroom, certain portions of the work we do are paid out at what we call a nominal hourly rate of $92.40, which has not changed for the last 7 years, despite inflation over that time increasing by more than 19%. So that's, so now that we're working with an $82 or whatever it is per hourly rate in reality of what we're doing here on the ground today. And don't worry, we're not actually getting even $82 an hour into our pockets for every hour we spend on files. I think the best estimate I have heard people come up with is we're probably spending another 75% of our time on a file uncompensated, okay, for the work that actually needs to be done sorry, I just had something on my screen there. For the work that actually needs to be done to competently and properly represent that accused person. BC and Ontario in particular, their sort of average rate for the equivalent file in Alberta is somewhere around $115 to $125, maybe $130 an hour for that same type of work. So we're just asking for parity, if that's to answer your question briefly, and I can expand more if you want.
Well, what I want to know kind of, and I'll ask Danielle this, is what has changed? Because there was a 2018 agreement that expired, and it seemed like the amount of funding for legal aid increased sharply over a period, then dropped. The government is saying that they have actually increased funding for legal aid by 47%, but it's unclear looking at this information if they mean, the peak was a 47% increase and that's now dropped off. So what's actually going on here with the funding and these agreements and the changing funding over the years?
So I would agree with you that, of course, politics and politicians look for the best numbers possible to report on, and they certainly did look at the peak. And what happened at the beginning of the governance agreement back then was that they agreed to an infusion to bring Legal Aid Alberta back up to somewhere resembling where it should have been for the previous decade before that. So it was that infusion was just to bring it up to parity rather than to put it any further ahead. And then the governance agreement guaranteed further stabilized funding. And within a year of that, as you saw in the graph, those payments were reduced. They did not deliver the budget that they promised to. And as a result, we're now in a crisis situation where Legal Aid Alberta is being given the green light by the provincial government to modernize the tariff system, to revamp the way that lawyers are compensated, but without providing them with any of the necessary support to do it. So our view is that this is the critical juncture. This is the time to do it. This is the time to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and not to agree to review it next year. They're not even making a commitment to add funding next year at this point. They're only simply saying, we'll look at it next year. So that's nothing at all. That is just political speak to say, maybe we'll look at it, maybe we won't. There's nothing guaranteed there, and there's no point in doing a modernization without that.
We've only got about 30 seconds, but Ian, what, in short, do you hope this job action is going to achieve?
As I said to someone else recently, the time for, as Danielle has said, the time for talk is over. It's not a question of if we should be increasing legal aid funding. It's not a question of when we should be doing it. We need to do it. We need to do it now, not next year. And the only real question is, what are the dollars going to be? So let's skip the small talk and get straight to the numbers.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing legal aid in Alberta and a vote by some legal aid lawyers to engage in job action. Now, Ian, the justice system is already overwhelmed with really long delays. This is kind of a chronic problem everywhere in Canada. So how do you respond to some of the concerns that job action by legal aid lawyers is going to make these delays worse, and that the price is ultimately going to be paid by legal aid clients, many of whom, as you've identified, are very vulnerable people?
Yes, the term is commonly used, short-term pain for long-term gain. And, I can't really come up with anything better to describe what we're doing. We're trying to save the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in Alberta from I hate to talk doom and gloom, but that we're actually trying to save thousands and thousands of future cases from either being delayed, dismissed, or individuals being wrongfully convicted. That's what we're trying to do. And if we don't succeed now, then the system will fail and stop.
Danielle, why do you think the government has been dragging its feet on funding? I know that there's always this really unfortunate and completely inaccurate perception of the public not liking criminal defense lawyers, which I have done a lot on this show to try and dispel that perception. But do you think that negative public feeling about criminal defense work contributes to the political thinking here that we can just not fund this kind of thing and the public won't care?
Well, first, let me thank you for your efforts. So yes, we are quite often the least liked lawyer in the room. And it shows. I've seen that. And unfortunately, that becomes readily apparent in rural Alberta. It is it's historically a conservatively thinking area and voter base. And that is where much of the UCP gets their votes from. So the get tough on crime, they don't let people out on bail. That is a platform that they feel that they can secure votes on. And of course, that is funding Legal Aid Alberta to fund lawyers who are going to help with those bail hearings would seem to undercut that platform for them. So certainly there's a lot of different dynamics, as Ian mentioned earlier, but that's clearly a pretty obvious one in Alberta, unfortunately.
Ian, there's always competing financial priorities for governments. And I know this is a typical part of the political narrative in Alberta is like, how do you prioritize these competing costly programs? So why is it that you think, what do you want people to know about legal aid that should help people understand why this is an area that deserves prioritization?
I got one sentence for you. There have been studies, worldwide studies, numerous studies for the last several decades that demonstrate conclusively that for every dollar spent on a legal aid program like this, you're going to save between $5 and $9 of social government spending in other areas, be it the healthcare system, the education system, the social welfare system, the mental health system. So we save you big money, Albertans. Please support our cause.
Danielle, anything you want to add to that?
Only that, it's not just about criminal defense lawyers. It's family lawyers, it's immigration lawyers, it's some civil lawyers. So anybody out there that is going through a terrible separation or divorce and relies on their legal aid lawyer, please support us as well, because family lawyers are being shafted just as much under this modernization without funding as we are.
Yeah, as I said in the introduction, there's all kinds of services available through legal aid. It's not just criminal defense, it's family law, domestic violence, representatives for victims of sexual violence. There's a whole area, whole different areas of the law that are covered by legal aid. Danielle Boisvert, Ian Savage, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story today.
My pleasure.
We've heard today about job action by legal aid lawyers in Alberta. What do you think of the role these lawyers play in our justice system and how this program should be funded? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.